Hello folks, it's Rob Timmings here from ECT for Health, here with our KYJ, Knowing Your Jargon series of video video logs. This episode is part 3 of a 3-part series that we started on understanding hemostasis. And so if you haven't caught the first 2 videos, this is the last of 3 parts. If you didn't catch the first 2, probably a good idea to go back to video number 1, video number 2, just to keep things in sequence. So what we talked about in the previous 2 videos is how hemostasis is a 3-part process, and it involves these steps. So what we actually have is vasoconstriction that we covered in video number 1. Our last video was on clotting. That's not going to help if I undo that, but let's cross clotting off. And we're up to coagulation, which is step number 3. A little bit more complicated than the other 2 steps, but you're going to nail it. We're not going to go into too much detail. We're really just going to give a basic brief overview of coagulation and how clotting and coagulation are not the same thing, but they're interrelated. So our story starts with a sad story. Actually, there is a blood vessel wall that has been injured. There is a blood vessel here. Let's call this any kind of an artery or a vein. And what we need to understand is that whenever there is an artery or a vein that is damaged, then of course the body's going to start to signal a series of processes to ultimately to stop the vessel from leaking. We don't want to bleed to death, and so your body is going to do absolutely everything it can to try and minimize the amount of fluid loss. Those first 2 steps, vasoconstriction, causes those blood vessels to constrict, to narrow the flow that's going through them, and then platelets being exposed and excited by that layer of collagen that lies underneath the endothelial surface of an exposed or a damaged vessel wall. Platelets are highly attracted to that collagen and will start to stick to that collagen. That's called adhere. And then they will become activated. And when they become activated, the surface of the platelet thrombocyte cell itself actually starts to change shape, and you learned in the last video that they become like a gnarly little starfish as they start to link and stick to other platelets. The other thing that platelets do is they secrete a couple of chemicals, and we talked about ADP, which is secreted to attract other platelets to come, and this chemical called thromboxane A2. And what the thromboxane A2 does is it further activates more platelets, excites them, it causes vasoconstriction, and it's part of that inflammatory cascade that of course needs to be initiated. If we're ever going to repair the tissue, then of course we need to mount an inflammatory process, and platelets are quite remarkable in that they are initiating the tissue healing right from the get-go. They also initiate this process called coagulation, and coagulation is a complicated process. What we're going to do with coagulation, I'll just get rid of these platelets from the last session. We'll rub those ones out just to make sure that they're not in the way. What we're going to understand about coagulation is that it's a chemical cascade that occurs within the plasma. So just as a little bit of a recap, if we could, let's take a test tube, and let's say we filled that test tube up with blood. There it is. Maybe that test tube represents all of the blood that's in your body. That's about 5.5 litres of blood that you've got floating around inside your body right about now. And you've seen blood when it's in a test tube. What happens with blood in a test tube is that it sort of separates out a little bit. And so if we could have a look at the distribution of sort of what's in the blood, and I've done a whole video on the components of blood, so I won't dwell too much on this, but let's say around about 35% of what's in the blood are the cells. Are the cells in your blood, red blood cells, platelets, white blood cells, and the other sort of 65%, that's your plasma. And in your plasma, you've got obviously water, you've got electrolytes, you've got fats, you've got carbohydrates, and you've got proteins. And those proteins take many, many different forms. They're proteins that are used for coagulation. They're proteins that are used for binding with water and carrying drugs. So albumin is in there. There's globins. There's immunoglobulins. They're the antibodies that your white blood cells manufacture to maintain a humoral immunity. Most importantly, though, for the discussion that we're going to have, is this particular family of proteins that are floating around in your bloodstream, put there by your liver. Your liver manufactures these proteins, and these are the coagulation. Lost my T. That's not a T. What am I doing? Coagulation factors. There they are, the coagulation factors. And this video is really going to focus on the last steps of that coagulation cascade. So what we're talking about here with coagulation is a function of the plasma. It's not a function of the cells, it's a function of the plasma, and particularly the coagulation factors that are involved in it. Now, at some point in your previous learning, you probably learned about this intrinsic pathway and the extrinsic. And fundamentally, the intrinsic coagulation pathway and the extrinsic coagulation pathway were two different pathways that stimulate your blood to start to solidify. And that's what coagulation means. To solidify a liquid is to coagulate that liquid. If you think of turning milk into yogurt or cheese, or turning egg into a scrambled egg or a custard, that's a coagulation process that you've undertaken. Well, if the liquid plasma of your blood solidifies, that process is called coagulation. And not like those cooking processes that I just mentioned. It is a chemical chain reaction that happens within proteins, and particularly these proteins are the coagulation proteins. Now, the intrinsic pathway is a pathway where a number of proteins are activated and coagulation becomes spontaneous. If you should have the introduction of any negatively charged ions that come into your body, bacteria and platelets can activate this intrinsic pathway. The extrinsic pathway is activated by tissue factors, factors that are released into the bloodstream or exposed to the bloodstream when a blood vessel is damaged or injured. Can you see that if I cut myself or injure myself, not only have I got platelets that are going to intrinsically be telling my coagulation pathway to start, but also I've got tissue factors that have been exposed to my blood and my plasma that are also going to stimulate or activate the coagulation cascade. And what comes down to is three key players. They are factor number 10, Roman numerals, factor number 10, factor number 2, which is commonly called prothrombin. So this might be a term you're familiar with, prothrombin. And factor number 1, commonly called fibrinogen. Now, these factor 10, factor 2, and factor 1 are all proteins that are manufactured in your liver. So, as we can appreciate, if you had severe liver damage or severe liver injury and your liver wasn't functioning, that's why people who you've cared for in the past with liver disease have real problems with coagulation. They have problems with bleeding because they haven't made these factors. They're not floating around in the bloodstream in their dormant state, ready to be woken up and ready to start to coagulate when the time comes, when somebody needs to coagulate. So the intrinsic and the extrinsic pathways, stimulated by an injury to a blood vessel wall and the activation of platelets that are releasing chemicals, first of all switches on this factor number 10. And when factor number 10 switches on, it is said to become activated. It's now called 10A, or activated factor 10. It doesn't do anything by itself. but it activates. And there's a few things that are needed for that to take place. Calcium's required for that process, and a few other chemicals. Vitamin K is required to manufacture factor 10. But the important point is that platelets have woken up or activated factor 10, this protein floating around in your blood. Now, once 10 has become activated, it activates prothrombin. Now, prothrombin, when it wakes up, it's woken up by factor 10A here. When prothrombin wakes up, it converts into, as you would probably have guessed, factor 2A activated, and this is called thrombin. Can you see that prothrombin activates into thrombin? This is an active substance here. Thrombin then wakes up fibrinogen, and fibrinogen turns into 1A, and that is the end of the coagulation cascade. That's called fibrin. Now, in our previous videos, we talked about clots that formed from platelets that clumped together. But once platelets clump together and have a big old group hug, they don't stay stuck together. They disintegrate and break apart very, very easily. So this fibrin actually is like string. And what the fibrin does is it wraps itself around the platelets and it binds them together like wrapping string around a Christmas present. So here we've got, if I can zoom into this damaged part of the blood vessel here, we'll rub away that red arrow. Let's get rid of that. We've got ourselves some platelets, and we're going to make them green here, and these platelets have started to plug up the hole and form a clot, essentially like a plug in the bath. It's going to stop that blood vessel from leaking. That's our primary platelet plug, or what's called a clot. And now what's going to happen, I'll just make that a little smaller. Now what's going to happen is, because these platelets have been activated and they're starting to stimulate that factor 10 turning into 10A, and factor 2 prothrombin turning into thrombin, and then factor 1 fibrinogen converting into fibrin. Fibrin are those little strands of string, and they wrap themselves like a Christmas present ribbon around the platelet plug. And that clot has now become stabilized. You can see it's like a mesh that's wrapped itself around that clot. No longer is that called a clot. That's now called a thrombus. A thrombus. So a thrombus is a clot, a clump of platelets, that has been wrapped up with fibrin string. That's called a thrombus. That is the process of coagulation. Now, as red blood cells come along, red blood cells get trapped in that sticky fibrin, and then more fibrin forms, and more platelets get stuck. Platelets are smaller than red blood cells. And then more red blood cells get stuck. Can you see the clot starts to form and get bigger and get bigger and get bigger, and this stabilizes the thrombus and makes it a nice strong thrombus that's going to stop that bleeding. Fundamentally, the last step of our hemostasis process. So we have vasoconstriction as phase 1. Step 2 is the clotting. They're the platelets that activate and clump together and call each other and stick together. And then we have the formation of this fibrin that wraps like string around the platelet ball, forming a thrombus or tightening the clot. Your body tries to break that down when it's done its job, and as the body starts to chop away at that fibrin, what's left behind are tiny little fragments. And those tiny little fragments of fibrin, they're called D-dimer, and you'll recognise those as a blood test that we sometimes do on a patient. D-dimer looks for the breakdown of a clot that you had somewhere in your body at that moment in time. Well, that brings us to the end of that 3-part series on hemostasis. Video number 3 done and dusted. So if you have any suggestions for any other videos that you'd like me to do with this whiteboard format, please go ahead, leave a comment. I'd be very, very keen to hear what you have to say. This is a new concept for videos that I'm uploading, so let me know what you think, and I hope you got something from it. My name is Rob Timmings from ECT for Health. Check out our ectforhealth.com.au website and have a look at some of our courses and seminars coming to areas near you. See you later, guys.